Hello and welcome to my presentation. Today I will be focusing on the various factors that affect child rearing practices during early adulthood. So to put you all in perspective, early adulthood extends from ages 18 to 40 years old. During this stage, there's a couple of different key events or milestones, if you will, that take place. Usually we finish our secondary education, which ends up in us receiving a high school diploma or getting a GED later on. We also tend to get married within this age range. So with marriage comes children, and hopefully active parenting comes along as well. Just a quick review. As we learned earlier this quarter, there's a couple different parenting styles that we tend to use. Authoritative, highly responsive and demanding. Authoritarian, demanding but not as responsive. Permissive, warm and accepting, but uninvolved and uninvolved, which is unaccepting and uninvolved. It's important to note that these parenting styles may change with age or experience, so just keep that in mind. There's a lot of different factors that play into parenting: your childhood, your education, your social economic status, which is comprised of your income, occupation, education, and your self-esteem. Self-esteem usually improves with age, and the higher your self-esteem, the more likely you are to use a favorable parenting style, like an authoritative parenting technique. Moving back on to childhood, your childhood parenting styles that the parenting styles that your parents used when you're younger modeled the parent-child relationship. So, for example, if they were very demanding when you were younger, you may grow up to unknowingly use that same technique. Parents usually notice this when they catch themselves talking or behaving in such ways as their parents did. This could be either good or bad, but it really depends on the parenting style that your parents used. Likewise, if you resented your parents, you might want to be nothing like them, right? So, if they were uninvolved and you lack that parent-child relationship, you might become an authoritative parent. If you lack structure when you're a child, you might become an authoritarian parent in order to provide that for your kids. Moving on to education. After high school or secondary education, there's a lot of different career paths that one could take. Depending on which path is taken will affect how soon one will be able to sustain and raise a child. So, for traditional students who attend college fresh out of high school, they usually tend to put off marriage and children until after they graduate. If they decide to pursue graduate school, they might end up postponing having children even later until their late 20s or early 30s. There's vocational schools. Individuals who join the military, they generally tend to marry earlier because they're generally more financially secure for the time being than their peers in college. There's also those that do not receive any education in their early adulthood. This leads to financial instability, and they usually tend to bear children at a younger age. The less education you have education is a good indicator of how early or how much later you will have children. The less education you have, the earlier you'll have children. That's generally speaking, of course. Moving on to SES. As I stated earlier, SES is comprised of your income, your occupation, and your education, but also affects various other factors, such as your family quality of life, the nutrition you're able to provide for your family, the school districts that your kids attend, and neighborhood safety. Families who find themselves in a low SCS, they usually tend to use an authoritarian parenting style. These parents are very demanding and they usually have high expectations. They may do this because they want a better future for the kids and they don't want them to make the same mistakes that they did. This parenting style is associated with children who do poorly in school, but this parenting style was also found to be successful in families who lived in unsafe neighborhoods. Uh, it was found to be successful because they're able to provide more structure for their kids, so they're able to block out those influences from their neighborhoods. These families also generally experience a greater level of stress, and they usually have higher divorce rates. So parents display or they play different roles in their families. So, for example, if a father is more demanding, a mother might take the nurturing and more responsive role. Uh, if one parent becomes uninvolved, it's up to the single parent to play both of those roles. Excuse me. Moving on to high SES. High SES families usually use an authoritative approach. So they're also more responsive and they may have picked up this parenting style from their parents, which is why they ended up in a higher SES bracket. Um, they're usually more nurturing with their children and they usually tend to work around their children's skills rather than trying to shape their children into something they're not. Likewise, parents whose careers take up much of their time, they may not be as responsive, and they instead they may become more demanding and use a more authoritarian approach. So, for example, we all know those parents that put extra emphasis on their kids' grades, or they expect them to grow up to become doctors or lawyers or all those other prestigious careers. Moving on to self-esteem, research suggests that there's a connection between parenting styles and global self-esteem. Global self-esteem is comprised of both internal and external factors. Internal factors are things like emotions, personality traits, things of that nature. External factors are comprised of your family, your career, your level of education, and events that have taken place earlier on. It was found that parents who used an authoritarian parenting style suffered from a lower self-esteem. This, of course, negatively affects their children's self-esteem. Um, they might put extra emphasis on areas where they failed as children onto their children, and or they might even become unresponsive or uninvolved with their child's upraising or upbringing. Um, Likewise, parents who were both responsive and demanding, they had a higher self-esteem. So they use a more authoritative approach. They usually have more dialogue between them and their kids, and they work around their child's ability rather than shaping them, as I said earlier. Uh, it's important to note that as our self-esteem improves, so does our parenting style. It's also important to note that inconsistent parenting can lead to aggressive and rebellious children, but nonetheless, responsiveness and sensitive parenting qualities are critical for a child's successful development. Um, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. That's all. Um, if you're wondering, I'm using the website called Prezi here. It's like a PowerPoint, except it's more interactive. So I hope you enjoy my presentation, and I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of yours.